Hey everyone, my name's Bradley and this is part 2 of my commentary/review of Gargoyles Season 2. This time we're going to be looking at all the episodes from Outfoxed up through Kingdom. And as usual, I'm going to be assuming that you've already seen these episodes, so if you haven't watched them yet, just know that you might not get a whole lot out of this video. With that said, let's get started. We're going to start off the review with Outfoxed, which is where we're going to meet Renard and Vogel, and it's going to be revealed that Fox is pregnant. So one of the main purposes of this episode is to show that Fox is just as cunning as Xanatos. Now, in previous episodes like Vows or Her Brother's Keeper, Fox was mostly there to help guide Xanatos' plan along. Like, she wasn't the driving force behind the plot in those episodes. Here in Outfoxed, however, she basically brings Cyberbiotics to his knees by making just a few moves. Her actions in this episode establish that she is just as cunning and powerful as her husband. It makes her marriage with Xanatos menacing, in a way, because now the Gargoyles have to keep up with two extremely intelligent characters who are pretty much as close to each other as you can get. So I like that this episode makes it clear that Fox is plenty intelligent and capable on her own. Another interesting character in this episode is Renard. He's kind of a grumpy character, but he's not a bad guy. And what's interesting to me is that Renard and Goliath have a common enemy in Xanatos. But Renard doesn't trust Goliath because Xanatos previously made Goliath seem like a villain to him. So while Renard and Goliath are on the same side, Xanatos' antics have put them at odds with each other. Similarly, it's neat that Renard has a familial connection to Fox, another one of Goliath's enemies. And I love how Renard's frustration with his daughter makes him an understandably conflicted character. So I think that the episode effectively introduced Renard and also showed the consequences of one of Xanatos' schemes. One thing that I'm glad that the episode did not do was point out that Vogel looks exactly like Owen. It's obvious that there's some sort of connection between the two, but the episode isn't deliberately saying that. It respects our ability to figure that out. I guess it's a little weird that Goliath doesn't seem fazed by Vogel's familiar face, but I'm glad that the episode isn't explicitly stating, oh, hey, look at this character. He's totally got a connection to Owen. Wow, stay tuned to find out more. After watching this episode, I was curious about Vogel's apparent connection to Owen, but I'm glad that the episode has had faith in the viewer's ability to notice that. My first complaint with this episode is that I feel like it recycled a bit too much footage from Awakening. When I rewatched Outfoxed for this video review, I actually timed the flashback of Goliath and Demona destroying Fortress 1, and here in my notes I wrote that there was over a minute and a half of footage reused from Awakening. I mean, the main plot point from Awakening that is relevant to Outfoxed is the fact that Fortress 1 was destroyed as a result of Goliath being tricked by Xanatos. Okay? That's it. I feel like that fact could easily be established in a previously on Gargoyles intro. The extended flashback here initially made me wonder if Demona was going to make an appearance later on in this episode, but she doesn't. So the minute and a half of reused footage felt like padding to me. Next, I feel like the action in this episode didn't have much tension. To me, the only time the Cybots demonstrated a level of power was when they successfully captured Goliath at the start of the episode. From that point on, the Cybots rarely felt dangerous to me. Goliath easily kills them or even gets them to shoot each other in nearly all of his encounters with them. Even Renard's little laser beam tears right through the Cybots, and Renard himself never seems concerned about the outcome. To me, the Cybots felt about as capable as, the battle droids from the Phantom Menace. Another element of the episode intended to build tension was the imminent collision with the tower. And this is a good premise because it keeps the characters moving, but we get so few updates of how much time they have left that this situation did not feel urgent to me. Even at the end of the episode, when they have 10 seconds before the collision, everybody is calmly handling this life or death situation. Just walking slowly, low energy. It's this isn't a big deal at all. So I feel like the episode failed to build much tension with its action. I also felt like the dialogue here was a bit weak. I thought that too often characters would simply state their feelings. I appreciate that, blah blah blah. Or, you've given me much to consider. Or, we're even. No, we are friends. There wasn't a whole lot left to our imaginations because the characters were straight up telling us what's on their minds. To me, the characters oftentimes sounded disinterested in what was going on. As I said earlier, when they're about to crash, the characters' lines lacked much sense of urgency. I mean, it's like Awakening 3. Okay, I can tell that the voice actors were giving it their best. It's just that the script's choice of words hampered the potential emotion of the episode. In the end, I feel pretty neutral towards Outfoxed. I really like the character side of it. The plot between Fox and Vogel is fun, and I like the way Renard's character is introduced. However, I feel like the action side of the episode could have been better. The action scenes felt pretty one-sided to me, and the characters seemed disinterested in the potential collision between Fortress 2 and the tower. So this is one of those episodes that I don't have a strong opinion about either way. Next up is Revelations, which is going to properly give us a look into the Illuminati and have Matt learn of the Gargoyles' existence. I loved the way this episode showed off all the elements of Matt's character. It reminds me of how the Silver Falcon demonstrated pretty much all of Broadway's character traits that had been established up to that point. Here in Revelations, we see traits such as Matt's determination and aggression, like when he drives the car to scare Elisa into giving him information. We also see how Matt will do anything to achieve his goals. In this case, we're initially led to believe that Matt has betrayed Goliath to Mace Malone in order to get a look into the Illuminati. And of course, we see Matt's superstition because it's Matt. We even see, for lack of a better term, how dorky Matt can be. Like at the end of the episode, Martin Hacker welcomes Matt to the Illuminati, and he says something like, "We'll see you again later, Matt." And then Matt lamely wails, "Yes, you will!" I mean, that's Matt. I think that this episode did a great job at showing off Matt's character, and I liked seeing how his personality was conveyed through his choices that he made throughout the episode. While we're on the subject of Matt, this episode successfully convinced me that Matt had gone bad. The plot actually starts off with Mace and Matt watching Goliath fight for his life, and Mace refers to Matt as an excellent Judas, which Matt seems to take pride in. I thought that he had essentially sacrificed Goliath in order to get in with the Illuminati, so I was sort of skeptic of him throughout a lot of the episode. I wanted to see how he came to seemingly betray Goliath. And I think that's the key to holding the audience's attention in a story. Get them to ask questions like, whose side is Matt on? And the anticipation of having those questions answered is what holds the audience's attention. And I think that's something that this episode did really well. I also found the Hotel Cabal to be surprisingly disorienting and even scary. Right from the start, we see Goliath fighting for his life in this hotel. I mean, there are death traps all over the place. For example, just when Goliath thinks he's safe, the room rotates itself upside down. Or later on, he's on top of the elevator, but then there are spiked grinder things at the top of the elevator shaft. These constant traps kept me on my toes, and I liked seeing Goliath be challenged by all these situations. There's a legitimate sense of danger that made the episode interesting to watch. And seeing Mace get increasingly involved in ensuring Goliath's death was also compelling. He starts off sitting in his master control room, letting his traps do most of the work, but then he ends up directly intervening when he tries to shoot Goliath through the one-way mirror. Mace absolutely cannot let Goliath escape, otherwise he'll be cut off from the Illuminati, and as a result, he'll lose access to the age-delaying drugs that are keeping him alive. The episode is basically a battle between Goliath and Mace competing for survival. The constant suspense of this episode is its greatest strength, in my opinion. I do feel like there were some conveniences here, though. First of all, it's certainly lucky that Goliath went down the intended chute when he and Matt first arrived at the hotel. It would have caused problems for everybody, including Mace himself, if Matt and Goliath went down the wrong chutes, so I think that they all conveniently dodged a bullet there. Also, it felt a bit contrived to me that Goliath had Matt's key, since we never saw Goliath obtain it in the first place, and having the key let Goliath bypass a lot of the traps in the hotel, which I felt cheapened the otherwise well-defined feeling of danger. Next, I wasn't a big fan of Elisa's reasoning for keeping Matt in the dark about the Gargoyles. She says that she never told him because she wanted to feel special. It's like, okay, but that hasn't been a desire that she's expressed before this point. It's not like she struggles to stand out against her colleagues or her family members, for example. I had previously assumed that the main reason she never introduced Matt to the Gargoyles was in order to protect them from him. You see, Matt is a very impulsive person, so introducing him, of all people, to the Gargoyles would have been an understandably risky move in the past. But as the episode currently stands, I would have liked for Elisa's apparent desire to stand out to be established more beforehand. In the end, I think that Revelations is a pretty good episode. It's one of those episodes that gets better after you watch it a second time, because you have the whole picture in your mind and you can see how everything comes together. I love Matt's characterization, the sense of tension is great, so I think it's a great episode overall. Double Jeopardy is going to introduce us to Thalog, one of the show's recurring villains, as well as bring back Sevarius from Metamorphosis. So first of all, let's talk about Thalog. So this is his first episode, and so he's the main focus here. Now the thing about Thalog is that he's one of the few villains in the series that is purely evil, and yet despite that, I still think he's an entertaining and interesting character both in this episode as well as the rest of the show. Now the main reason why I like him here is because he felt very powerful. He's got the physical strength of Goliath as well as the intelligence of Xanatos. And like he sets up this elaborate scheme involving tricking Xanatos into bringing money for Sevarius, and then tricking Sevarius into thinking Xanatos wants Thalog taken away. Thalog basically manipulates his creators into letting him loose on the world with a nice $20 million. And, I mean, it's not often that we see someone outsmart Xanatos, but here Thalog did just that, and in his first episode to boot. So after seeing Thalog here, I was curious of what plans he was going to come up with in the future, as well as how the heroes were going to stop those plans, given how powerful of a character he is. So, I mean, if we define the main goal of this episode as establish Thalog as a powerful villain, then I would say that it accomplished that really well. Another thing I like about Thalog is his sense of humor. Any character, whether they're a good guy or a bad guy, is boring if they don't have a personality. And I think that purely evil characters like Thalog can easily fall into this trap due to their unchanging alignment. Fortunately, I think that Thalog's campy personality makes him a lot of fun to watch. Like when Goliath is screaming in pain and Thalog says, "Now I know where I got my temper." I'm glad that he's not some emo version of Goliath who can only think about chaos and destruction and death. Instead, he's a guy who can crack a joke. And the rest of the characters in this episode get some funny moments as well. Like when Hudson asks Goliath if he even knows how to laugh maniacally. Or there's this exchange between Broadway and Lexington. Broadway's like, "This is bad news." And Lexington replies, "You can say that again." And Broadway says, "This is bad news." It's so dumb, but it gets me every time I watch it. So, I mean, I liked the humor here overall. Next, this isn't something that I typically comment on, but I thought that the voice acting in this episode was particularly good. Keith David is fantastic as Thalog. I think he did a great job at conveying Thalog's bombastic yet intimidating personality. And I also thought that Tim Curry was pretty good as Savarius here. I thought he sounded more like an actual person here than he did the last time we saw him. I mean, I think Tim Curry's a good actor, but in Gargoyles, sometimes his acting is so over the top that it's a bit hard for me to take it seriously during important moments, like in Metamorphosis. Fortunately, I think that here in Double Jeopardy, he gives one of his better performances. I don't like the part when Xanatos gets the idea to revitalize Goliath with the electric disc. To me, it didn't seem like a logical answer to the situation. I think that in sticky situations like this, it's satisfying to see how the characters escape in a way that makes sense, but isn't apparent at first. So when Xanatos got the idea to recharge Goliath like an electric battery, I didn't have that satisfaction because to me it never seemed like a potential solution to begin with. Another part that I found a little silly was the part when Lex guessed the computer search code in a single attempt. I guess it's not a huge deal, but I don't like how little he had to work in order to gain access. In the end, I think this is a really fun episode. I love seeing Thalog carry out his elaborate plan. It's always a lot of fun to see how he uses the other characters to achieve his own goals. I just think it's a fun episode overall. Next we have Upgrade, which I think is one of the creepier episodes in the series. This is where the pack get, upgraded. And they remain in their upgraded forms for the remainder of the series. I think that this is a good episode for the pack as a whole. I've spoken in the past about how I don't think that most of the members of the pack are particularly sympathetic, but I think that they're still entertaining enough because of how dangerous they feel, as well as their usually excellent action scenes. Here in Upgrade, the pack felt more powerful than ever due to their new high-tech combat abilities. To me, it felt like they could actually do considerable damage to the Gargoyles. Like, for example, you can't outrun Jackal anymore due to his extending limbs and bullet-like fingers. You can't even touch Wolf anymore due to his new combination of power and speed, for example. I could go on. These guys felt intimidating to me, so the action scenes were a lot of fun to watch here. In addition to establishing their strength, I like that this episode sort of demonstrates the way the pack is falling apart. For example, you've got Dingo having second thoughts about the path the team is taking. And of course you have Fox, who is in a way playing against her former teammates. It's kind of sad, actually, seeing the pack drift away from each other. Another thing I like about Upgrade is the trio and their desires to be the second in command. The way I see it, Broadway and Lexington are more aggressively competing for leadership than Brooklyn is, but in the end, Brooklyn is the one who receives the title. And I like how Brooklyn was hesitant and kind of afraid of accepting the role. It's a nice demonstration of the idea that the person who should be given power is usually the one who wants it the least. Lastly, I'm relieved that the writers had Goliath select a single character to be the leader. When I first watched the episode, I honestly expected that there was going to be some lame cop-out, like Goliath lets all three of the trio be second in command or something stupid like that. So I'm glad that Goliath followed through on his goal of selecting a single leader. Something that I love about the trio is that they're all individual characters with their own arcs and development. They aren't like a single collective entity that always experiences the same things, but they have different personalities and reactions. Rather, they're still their own individual characters, just as much as, say, Goliath or Hudson. So one of the goals of this episode is to demonstrate Fox's intelligence, sort of like Outfoxed. Now, in that episode, Fox was primarily acting on her own. She wasn't really competing with anyone. Here in Upgrade, the episode is basically a game between Fox and Xanatos, which Fox ends up winning. I like that here we are seeing Fox's intelligence in direct comparison to Xanatos. I think that's one reason why their relationship is interesting, because they are so equally matched. That being said, I feel like the episode could build to Fox's victory a bit better. The battle between the Pack and the Gargoyles is meant to be this grand-scale battle of wits between Xanatos and Fox, yet we only see Fox make like one move in this metaphorical chess match, which is when she shows the trio that TV commercial. So when she won the game at the end, so to speak, I didn't feel as though she had done a whole lot, yet she was still able to outsmart friggin' David Xanatos. So while I like that the episode establishes Fox's intelligence as equal or even superior to her husband's, I think it could have been built to more. I also have a couple of nitpicks with this episode. Like there's the part at the end when Hudson's sword lands on the railroad, which somehow charges it up, and so Wolf picks up the sword and gets electrocuted and knocked out. Like, let me restate that. The sword itself, rather than Hudson, defeats Wolf. Just, what? There's also a couple of shots where Wolf looks completely different, like you can see here. And if I want to get really nitpicky, there's the chessboard that Fox and Xanatos are playing on. It has way too many squares, and it makes my inner chess nerd cringe. Overall, I like this episode. I think that it has plenty of good characterization. I really like Brooklyn's build-up to becoming second in command, as well as Dingo's uncertainty. The chess metaphor, it's fun, but I wish it was used more. Still, I think this is a pretty good episode overall, and I had a lot of fun watching it. Protection is another Dracon and Broadway type episode, like Deadly Force or Silver Falcon. This is also where Jalapeno is used for the first time. So one interesting character here is Pal Joey. We've only sort of seen him in the past, so I like that in this episode they flesh out his personality a bit more. I thought that it was interesting that he was worried about being outperformed by the Gargoyles, so that's why he set his bomb early. And later when Broadway goes into the building to investigate, Pal Joey seemed to regret setting his bomb, or at least he didn't want Broadway to presumably get killed, even though he saw the Gargoyles as his rivals. It makes me wish that we got to see more of him in later episodes. Another moment in this episode that I liked was when Goliath gave Dracon a scare at the end. It's one of those times when Goliath loses his temper and just lets loose. Seeing Goliath take Dracon on this roller coaster ride in the sky is fun, because you can tell that Goliath has just had it with Dracon, and I always like seeing Dracon get what he deserves. Dracon unfortunately remains a lackluster villain for me here. I've already spoken of his one-dimensionalness in previous reviews, and once again here in Protection, Dracon's primary motive is money, as usual. Now, I think it's fine to have a villain's primary motive be money, as long as there's a compelling reason why they need the money. But no such reason is given in this episode. Dracon just wants money because who doesn't want money? Along the same lines, I think that simple-minded bad guy villains can be fun as long as they feel capable, like Thalog, for example. But that's Dracon's other problem here. He doesn't accomplish a whole lot. I mean, maybe the writers could have led us to believe that Dracon had tempted Elisa into joining the bad guys. But as the episode currently stands, Elisa's dark turn is intended to appear as a choice that she made on her own. Really, the only thing that Dracon accomplishes here is the destruction of a single plot-irrelevant shop at the beginning of the episode. Every other shopkeeper is secretly part of the police. So when Dracon gets himself arrested at the end of the episode, I didn't feel like he had accomplished very much. I'm going to add another clickable card to the video at this point that should lead to a video by the movie reviewer Chris Stuckman. And in this video, I love the way he describes what makes a good villain. So if you click the card, it should take you exactly to the right spot in the video. But if not, the part I'm talking about is at 5 minutes and 30 seconds. So check that out if you're interested. Another problem I have with this episode is that I feel like a lot of the plot revolves around the Gargoyles not knowing that Elisa was undercover the entire time. And at the end of the episode, Elisa claims that she didn't have a chance to tell Goliath that she was going undercover. But would it really have taken too much time to run up to the clock tower and tell Goliath, hey, I'm going undercover? The whole thing would have taken like 3 minutes. And given that during this episode we see Elisa at the police station at night while the Gargoyles are awake, you'd think that she could just run up and tell them what's going on. If she truly did not have time to tell them in person, couldn't she have left a note for them? Or do you remember how Matt learned of the Gargoyles' existence a few episodes back? Why not make use of that plot point here? Have Elisa get Matt to tell the Gargoyles what's going on. But as it stands, Elisa's excuse that she didn't have time to tell Goliath feels like a lame attempt to justify the existence of an evil Elisa episode. So in the last point, I said that I think Elisa could totally have informed the Gargoyles of what was going on, but she didn't. You might say that the episode is what's called an idiot plot, which is basically a plot that could have been largely prevented had the characters not made obvious mistakes. Now, it's important to note that idiot plots are not inherently bad. In fact, writers can use them to convey a particular message. For example, many of Shakespeare's great tragedies could have been prevented had the characters not been idiots, but that's the entire point the story is trying to make. For example, in Shakespeare's King Lear, the kingdom is put into unworthy hands because of Lear's hunger for praise, and as a result this leads to Lear's downfall and eventual death. By the time he recognizes his pride and vanity, it's too late. The damage has been done. The idiot plot in King Lear works because it has lasting consequences. We've even seen this show effectively use idiot plots in the past. Episodes like Temptation or Deadly Force could have been largely prevented had the characters not made obvious mistakes, but I'm okay with those episodes because the characters still learn important lessons. In Temptation, Brooklyn, as well as the audience, personally experiences Damona's manipulative side, and Broadway's fear of guns is established in Deadly Force, for example. Even City of Stone itself was all about how Damona's inability to accept responsibility for her actions caused her downfall. Here in Protection, however, the fact that Elisa couldn't be bothered to tell Goliath what was up has no damaging effects. Elisa doesn't learn anything. In fact, by the end of the episode, everything is happily resolved between Elisa and Goliath, and Dracon is behind bars. So not only is Elisa kind of an idiot here, but everything ends up working out for her in the end. As I said earlier, I think that idiot plots can be used effectively, but they need to have lasting drawbacks that drive the theme of the story. Lastly, I was also disappointed by the animation in this episode. The character models looked off to me, and details like shading or the contours of characters' faces seemed to phase in and out of existence. I can put up with lower quality animation as long as the episode has an interesting plot, like Long Way to Morning for example, but here the episode's writing isn't doing the animation any favors. Overall, I do not like this episode. I found the writing weak and the concept gimmicky. The villainous characters felt incapable and uninteresting to me. It's not an episode that I enjoy going back to. We're going to move on to The Cage, which is another episode featuring the mutates. This is where Derek recognizes his mistake in trusting Xanatos, and he talks to his parents for the first time since his metamorphosis. I love the complicated themes of this episode. Goliath sees the grief that Elisa is going through, and so he kidnaps Savarius in hopes that he can get a cure for Derek. But Elisa tells Goliath that he was behaving like Xanatos in doing so, and I think that has a great message to it. It's a lot like how at the end of Awakening Part 5, Elisa tells Goliath to not kill Xanatos, because if he does, he would be no different than the monster Damona had become. Here in The Cage, Goliath was doing the wrong things with the right motivations. Sort of along the same lines, I liked seeing Derek's desire for revenge and how that drove his actions here, like when Xanatos tricks him into thinking Savarius was collaborating with the Gargoyles from the beginning. There's a lot of back and forth in this episode. It's pretty complicated. Everyone has a reason to believe that what they are doing is justified or even right. I've said in the past that I love how in this TV show, the lines between the good guys and the bad guys are sort of blurred, and I think that The Cage uses that concept really well. Savarius is another interesting part of this episode. One key element of his character is his inability to recognize his limits. His endless ambition oftentimes results in him regretting the results of his projects. In this episode, he secretly tries to kill the mutates with a poison, but he disguises it as a cure because of his regret in creating the mutates in the first place. Like, he's not interested in righting his wrongs so much as he is in concealing them. So I think that this episode did a good job at showing Savarius' selfishness and how that comes back to bite him. Another great character here is Maggie. I love seeing her insecurity in this episode, like when she accidentally reveals the location of the Gargoyles and then feels sorry for doing so. She accidentally sets the stage for this battle between the Gargoyles and the mutates, and it only further complicates her situation. Finally, at the end of the episode, there's this great scene where everyone's trying to decide if the antidote is actually poison or not. Maggie wants to take the antidote because she sees it as a win-win situation. She's living in so much pain that she doesn't care if she dies at this point, and that really made me sympathize with her. Now, remember that Maggie is just some normal woman from Ohio. Her life was permanently altered when Savarius turned her into a monster, and now she's looking for any possible way to get rid of the pain she's feeling, even if that means throwing her own life away. I think that Maggie is a particularly interesting character because of how she's forced into this new life and how she struggles to accept it. As for problems I have with this episode, the main one is probably the animation. It actually doesn't look bad like Protection did, but at the same time, I don't find it particularly fun to look at. To be honest, I can't quite put my finger on it. Like, maybe it's the colors and the lighting, which I felt were kind of blah in this episode. And I do think that the quality of the animation is an integral part of an episode's experience, because having a strong art style gives me engaged in the world of the story. Here in the cage, however, I found the animation a bit forgettable. Along the same lines, another animation complaint happens when Goliath goes to Castle Wyvern, and there's this shot where Claw looks completely off. I don't know much about the behind-the-scenes process of animation, but I feel like this is something that someone should have easily caught before the episode was finalized. Overall, I think that The Cage is a pretty good episode. The characterization here is really good, especially for Goliath, Derek, and Maggie. My main complaints with it are purely visual, so I think that it's a pretty solid episode overall. Up next is The Price, which is going to focus primarily on Hudson and Xanatos. This is where Xanatos is going to start his quest for immortality, which becomes a sort of running plot throughout the upcoming world tour. So first of all, the animation in this episode is glorious. It has this sort of anime vibe, and it looks so good. Like, it ticks all of the boxes. It's got smooth movement, the shading and lighting look great, the character models are accurate, the lip sync works really well. I mean, this is my 4th time watching the series, and I think that The Price might be one of the best, if not the best looking episode in the entire show. It's fun to just look at. This is also the episode in which we learn of Xanatos' fear of aging. It's a rare demonstration of his human nature, which we sort of got to look at in Eye of the Beholder. In my last video, I quoted another review of Gargoyles that said that a good way to develop a character is to take away what they want or have. And this episode uses that type of characterization, in a way. In the past episodes, Xanatos has almost always been able to come up with a plan for whatever challenge he's been up against. Here in The Price, however, Xanatos is put up against a problem that he doesn't know how to overcome. The one challenge he can't solve is his aging, so he's resorted to testing out ancient legends and magical artifacts. I love his line, "Nothing terrifies me, because nothing is beyond my ability to change." Because to me, it sort of sounds like he's in denial. Like, he knows that he can't stop death, but he's gonna try because he's David freaking Xanatos. There's a subtle but genuine sense of anxiety and even panic expressed by him. This guy has so much money and power that he isn't used to being pressured for time like he is in this episode. And I also like how he's trying to personally coax Hudson into going along with the plan. Like, Xanatos is trying to convince Hudson that the other gargoyles don't need Hudson, so he might as well be of some use to Xanatos. It's classic Xanatos, and I think that this is a great episode for his character. I guess I can't speak for everyone on this next point, but I was genuinely worried that the writers were going to kill off Hudson in this episode. And given that Hudson's my favorite character in the show, I was just a little worried about that. So Hudson's trapped in this cage, and the other gargoyles are busy protecting this decoy. Okay, meaning that they're not going to be saving the real Hudson when they aren't aware that he's missing in the first place. So when the Steel Clan robots came and removed the real Hudson from the cage in order to dip him into the cauldron, I was freaking out. Like, I was thinking, holy cow, are they actually going to do it? Like, is this the end of Hudson? And it didn't help that Hudson's speech about immortality right before he gets dunked in sounded to me like they could have been his final words before the writers killed him off. So needless to say, I was very relieved when Hudson managed to escape and get back together with the others. So I want to praise this episode for successfully getting me worried about what was going to happen. One little detail that I really liked was the repeated lines of dialogue from the Macbeth robots. Throughout the episode, he's only got like 4 or 5 lines, and he just repeats them over and over again. The first time I watched the episode, I was thinking, okay, did like the voice recorders only get like a couple of lines to work with? Is that why there's such little variety? But when you reach the end of the episode, it makes sense why he only had a couple of lines, because he's a robot. It makes sense for a robot to only have a few lines of speech. It's another one of those instances where the episode makes logical sense even before our questions are directly answered. I don't like the part when Broadway turns to stone mid-flight, and there's this crate of soft Persian carpets that Elisa uses to save him. I mean, Elisa shoots through this thin rope from a long distance away, and this crate of plush carpets happens to land right where Broadway's gonna fall. The whole sequence felt extremely convenient to me. Usually I think it's interesting when the gargoyles turn to stone at bad times, but the way the tension was resolved here made me roll my eyes. Another part that I found a bit contrived was the perfect replica of Hudson. It looks close enough to the real thing to convince Goliath and the others that it was Hudson himself. But what I don't get is how Xanatos made this statue so realistic. He doesn't know where Hudson and the other gargoyles sleep during the day, and it's not like he had Hudson pose in front of a sculptor for a few hours. So I thought that the decoy statue of Hudson was a bit weird. Despite a couple of logic-related quirks, I still think that The Price is an excellent episode. There's a lot of great characterization for Xanatos and Hudson here, and the animation is some of the best in the series. Now we're going to move on to the Avalon trilogy, which is a preface to the World Tour. Here in part 1, we're going to learn what happened to the humans from Castle Wyvern after the Gargoyles were frozen by a spell 1,000 years ago. My favorite part of this episode was seeing how characters like Princess Catherine or the Magus had developed since we last saw them. Back at Castle Wyvern, these characters were jerks to the Gargoyles, to say the least. But after things went wrong for really everyone, they recognized their misdoings and changed for the better. After Goliath was frozen in stone, we skipped ahead to modern New York, and the future of the princess and the others was largely a mystery to us. So I like that this episode explains to us how the princess and the others fulfilled their promises. For example, here we sort of get to see how the Grimorum left the hands of the Magus and safely made its way to Xanatos. I also love how the survival of the eggs is justified. Back in Awakening Part 2, Catherine says that she would watch over the gargoyle eggs as if they were her own. But later in that episode, Xanatos says that the eggs later disappeared. After watching Avalon Part 1, this still makes logical sense in retrospect. The eggs certainly disappeared from Earth, but that's because they found new life on Avalon. I like the story that the writers came up with here because it justifies the existence of gargoyles such as Angela in a way that still makes sense within the context of the show. So the main villain of this episode is Constantine, and he is absolutely nasty. The things he does to work his way to the throne are cruel, to say the least. He uses Fenella, Catherine, and even the gargoyle eggs as tools to achieve his goals. Like there's the part where he points to the gargoyle eggs and tells Catherine that she has 36 good reasons to obey him. Now, after seeing Constantine do all these horrible things, I believed Catherine when she said that Constantine would hunt her to the edge of the earth. So if we define the main purpose of Constantine's character as be a threat that pushes Catherine and the others to Avalon, then I would say that he successfully accomplishes the task that the writers needed him to. There's also two nice background details that I really like in this episode. At one part you can see the Magus writing his story in the Grimorum, which later on prompts Xanatos to move Castle Wyvern to the top of the Eerie building. And this is the last time that we see the Magus in contact with the Grimorum before he gives it to Fenella and Mary. So it's good that the writers added this detail to the episode. Another great detail is found in the scene where Constantine becomes king. All of the people in the background are cheering for him, except for Fenella. And the animators don't give us like a close-up to specifically point out, hey, look at Fenella. But it's great that they had her stay in character even when she's just being a person in the background. For me, my main problem with the episode is the abundance of exposition. There's a lot of ground to cover in this 20-minute long episode. We've got to show Tom arriving in New York, as well as Goliath, Elisa, and Bronx going with him to Avalon. And then we've got to have the flashback explaining how Tom is still alive in the 1990s, which means that we have to introduce all these characters like Fenella and Constantine and so on. The episode felt a bit crammed to me, especially because there were several scenes with characters explicitly telling us the current situation. For example, there's this part where everyone's in the library and Mary is saying stuff like, the king is smitten with Fenella, but she doesn't love him, because she's in love with Constantine, but he's actually a jerk and he's trying to get to the throne, and so forth. Nothing else happens in that scene, it's just telling us information that we have to know beforehand. I kind of wish that this Avalon trilogy was split up into 4 parts instead of 3, if only so that we could spend more time getting to know characters like Fenella and Constantine. I wanted to see these plotlines occur naturally, without the need for exposition dumps. Also, while I think that Constantine as a character accomplished what he needed to do, I don't think he did much else from a storytelling perspective. By that I mean that I found him a bit one-dimensional. Constantine wants nothing aside from power, and he wants power because who doesn't want some power? There's not much else to his character. I want to know why the idea of being king is appealing enough that he would literally kill for a chance at the crown. I mean, let's compare him to the villain from Disney's own movie Frozen. Okay? So, obvious spoiler alert. So, in Frozen, Prince Hans is sort of like Constantine in that he seeks power and tries to obtain it by marrying into the royal family. And at the end of the movie, he tries to kill Queen Elsa, just like how Constantine murdered King Kenneth here in Gargoyles. However, one significant difference between Hans and Constantine is that Hans is drawn to power for a reason. Hans thought that he had been dealt an unfair hand in life because his 12 older brothers meant that he would never have the opportunity to be king. So that's why he sought power. Because he thought that it was only fair that he had the same chance that his older brothers had. Going back to Constantine, you could say that he wants power because he's just that kind of person. But I find that about as interesting as Dracon's infinite desire for money. I feel like maybe if there's just one more episode in the Avalon trilogy, we could get some more insight into Constantine's character. I don't think that he has to be sympathetic or even likable, but I would like for him to be understandable. Still, while I found the episode a bit cramped at times, I still had a lot of fun with it. I liked seeing the little plot threads with Catherine and the others that were continued from Awakening Part 2, so I think that this is a good episode for the most part. Next is, of course, Avalon Part 2, which is effectively the first episode with Angela. She was in the previous episode, but only for a few seconds. So this part of the Avalon trilogy is primarily going to focus on the Archmage, the Weird Sisters, and their true intentions. So first, I was surprised by how funny this episode was. I love the part when the Gargoyles are fighting the Archmage's magical sand monsters, and he candidly says, "You beat up a beach." His interactions with his past self are also a lot of fun. Like, I love seeing the confidence of the present Archmage collide with the bewilderment of the past Archmage. Possibly the funniest part of the episode to me happens when the Archmage asks for the Weird Sisters' help. He says, "May I suggest an alliance?" And the sisters are like, "No, go away. We don't work with sorcerers." Then the Archmage promises them revenge on the Magus and the others. The sisters quickly say, "Okay, we're listening." Like, I think that the humor in this episode is particularly beneficial because while there's a lot of explaining that needs to be done, the little bits of comedy here and there prevent it from falling into boring exposition land. While we're sort of on the subject of the Weird Sisters, I also like that this episode demonstrates that they have flaws of their own. They aren't these perfect goddesses. They're more like the Olympian gods of Greek mythology in that they're magical immortals that are subject to the same temptations that ordinary mortals are. They aren't immune to their warnings of revenge that we saw in City of Stone, and I think that makes them interesting and flawed characters. After watching this episode, the Weird Sisters didn't seem like these aloof entities that hover above everyone else. Rather, they felt like characters with flaws, along the lines of Demona, for example. Another thing about this episode that I liked was the Archmage's initial plan to wait until morning to properly begin his attack. In a couple of the past episodes, I thought that the villains occasionally gave the heroes too much time to foil their plans, but here it makes sense for the Archmage to stall. The idea is that once morning arrives, the majority of Avalon's defenders will be turned to stone. Only like 5 humans would still be in the Archmage's way. This is great from a storytelling perspective because it puts pressure on the heroes to keep moving. They only have a few hours before sunrise, so if they don't hurry, Avalon, and eventually the rest of the world, could fall into the wrong hands. This time limit adds a lot of tension to the conflict, and it kept me on my toes. One great tidbit of this episode is the designs of the Avalon clan. I'm not talking about major characters like Angela or Gabriel, though they do both have good designs, but what I'm referring to is the background Gargoyles. These background characters greatly resemble the Gargoyles that we saw in Demona's clan back in City of Stone. Given the parentage of Angela, I think it's safe to assume that these background Gargoyles are the biological children of the ones that we saw in City of Stone. It's kind of sad, given that the parent Gargoyles in City of Stone lived out the rest of their lives, assuming that all of their eggs had been destroyed, when the reality is that they were safe on Avalon. I think that this visual detail in Avalon Part 2 goes a long way because it makes even the background characters in this episode, as well as City of Stone, feel like people who have lives and stories of their own. Speaking of Gargoyle ancestry, my main complaint with this episode is Elisa's blatant hint that Angela is the daughter of Demona and Goliath. It's not very subtle, and when I watched the episode for the first time, it was pretty obvious that Elisa was guessing correctly. Given that Angela does visually resemble Demona, as well as the fact that she has the same skin color and hair color as Goliath, I would have preferred to have speculated that connection in my head, and then have it be confirmed in an upcoming episode. I think that Avalon Part 2 is another great episode. I love seeing the Archmage's plan come together, and seeing the new Gargoyles was a lot of fun. I especially like the reveal that the Weird Sisters are not perfect, so I had a lot of fun watching this episode. Avalon Part 3 is going to round out the trilogy by showcasing the battle between the Archmage and Goliath. This is also the episode where we meet King Arthur in proper. I love the Magus in this episode. His backstory here made him a sympathetic character. For one thing, he's been living in Avalon for decades, well, I guess centuries, while seeing the woman he loves being with another man. It's not like he's mad at Tom, but you can tell that the Magus is lonely. I also like that he explains that he stayed in Avalon because his guilt was so great that he felt responsible for everything that's happened to Goliath. The Magus wanted to atone for the mistakes that he made back at Castle Wyvern. I love comparing the Magus here to what he was like back in Awakening Part 1 and 2, where he was proud and aggressive. He's come a long way, and seeing his humility in this episode made his death all the more impactful to me. It's a lot like how City of Stone Part 3 made Macbeth a sympathetic character, so that his downfall in Part 4 would be all the more emotional. The Archmage is sort of interesting here as well. He's absolutely hungry for power, but that's what leads to his downfall in the end. He's got the 3 talismans, and so he thinks that he has no limits. He actually says at one point that he's having too much fun to just kill everyone in a single blow. but when he loses the Eye of Odin, he's unable to control the power of the remaining talismans, and he dies shortly thereafter. Normally I don't find power-hungry villains particularly interesting, but I think it works for the Archmage here because one of the themes of the episode is the cost and risk of power. I also like the way the Magus defeated the Weird Sisters here. Early on in the season, it was hinted that Oberon's children are weak to iron, which we saw with Puck in the mirror. Here in Avalon Part 3, the Magus is able to beat the Weird Sisters by binding them with metal chains, just like with Puck. Now, we aren't explicitly told that the third race is vulnerable to iron until a later episode, but here that rule is still in play even though it hasn't been directly established yet. I also thought it was creative to have the iron come from the suits of armor that Elisa and the Magus encountered earlier on. Like when the Magus returns to the Hollow Hill during his battle with the Weird Sisters, those suits of armor are still on the ground. And that's great because it makes sense for them to still be there since they were never destroyed or otherwise removed from the playing field. It's a neat little setup and payoff. I would have liked for Angela's departure from Avalon to be set up a bit more. At the end of the episode, she asks Goliath if she can come along with him because she wants to see the outside world, but that desire isn't really established beforehand. Maybe in this episode, as well as in the previous one, they could have had Angela be asking Goliath what it's like in this Manhattan place that he's mentioned. Or she could be talking about the stories of Scotland she's heard from the humans and how she hopes to go there someday. That way she could have had more of an established curiosity of the outside world. I also would have liked to have seen a bit more of King Arthur. There's a lot of hype and anticipation leading up to his introduction, but he isn't used a whole lot here. He's cool and he can kick plenty of butt. However, the episode doesn't do much with him aside from having him fight Macbeth. It barely even explains why he was on Avalon in the first place. Now, as someone who was not familiar with the real-world legend of King Arthur, I had no idea why he was asleep in the Hollow Hill. But after doing some research, I now understand why he was on Avalon. But I still would have liked for the episode to provide a little bit of backstory to get me up to speed. For comparison, look at how The Mirror briefly explained who Oberon and Titania are. That episode doesn't assume that the audience is familiar with A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I wish that Avalon Part 3 had done a similar thing and offered some brief explanation for Arthur. I think that this is a solid episode overall. The Magus' characterization is awesome, and I love seeing his redemption, and I thought that his death was effectively emotional. I would have liked for Angela and Arthur to get a little more explanation, but the episode was still fun for me to watch in the end. Shadows of the Past is the first mainline world tour episode. Here the travelers go back to Scotland, and we get to see Hakon and the captain again. I love Goliath's uncertainty in this episode. Here he's put into a highly vulnerable position, as he's constantly ridiculed by these hallucinations of characters that he knew from Castle Wyvern. In the past, we've seen plenty of times where Goliath's physical strength gets tested, but here his mental strength is being tested. For instance, Goliath is seeing and hearing his dead rookery brothers and sisters call him a betrayer and a murderer. In other words, Goliath is hearing his own family members condemn him. And this isn't the sort of challenge that Goliath has faced in the past. He also starts seeing Elisa and Angela as Hakon and the captain, so he tries to run away because he knows that he can't control his emotions. It's a nice demonstration of Goliath's inner conflicts, and I love the line, "Old wounds sometimes bleed as bright as new ones." This is a great quote because it demonstrates what makes Goliath a believable character. Even though he's sort of like a superhero, he still experiences guilt and fear like everyone else does. So I think that the episode does a great job at bringing up his hidden weaknesses. I also really like the look of this episode. There's a nice level of detail, and the movement is very fluid. I especially like the lighting on the characters, like in the various scenes that took place in dark rooms, but they were illuminated by a small but powerful light. I think that the episode looks great overall. The episode also has a great sense of atmosphere to it. As the episode goes on, Goliath becomes more and more distant from his friends, both physically and mentally. Given that the episode is primarily told from Goliath's perspective, the episode is also making us feel isolated from the rest of the world. This is one reason why I think that this is one of the scariest episodes in the show. If Goliath runs into trouble, no one will be there to help him. He's probably hundreds of feet underground, and Bronx and the girls are struggling to catch up to him. It results in an atmosphere that feels lonely and almost helpless. I also love the part when Goliath enters the room with that ancient magical shrine that Hakon and the captain were leading him to. Goliath has no knowledge of this place or what he's up against, and there's nobody alive that can tell him what's going on. So I was pretty anxious during these scenes because I had no idea what to expect. Now I feel like here I should note that I don't watch horror movies, so I'm probably not the most knowledgeable person on the subject of creating fear in a story, but I think that the reason this episode's atmosphere works so well is because we as humans are naturally surprised by what we are unable to anticipate. The episode deliberately withholds this cave's backstory from us, and that's why it's scary to us. Or to me, at least. I also like the captain's characterization here. His story sort of reminds me of the Magus from the previous episode. The captain's been living in guilt for hundreds of years, so it's nice to see him finally get a chance to atone for his wrongdoings. One advantage of the world tour is that we get to see a couple of the show's side characters, like the captain, get some nice resolution. And I think that the most logical way to bring back the captain is to have an episode take place in Scotland, something you can only do in the world tour. So, I'm not going to talk about most of the world tour until the next video, because that's where most of the world tour episodes are. But I will say that currently, the captain has one of my favorite side character conclusions. My main problem with this episode is the pacing. Most of the essential plot events happen at the very beginning and very end of the episode, and in between I felt is sort of repetitive. You've got Goliath seeing hallucinations, and so he gets scared, and so he goes further into the cave, and then he sees more hallucinations, and then you repeat it a couple times. So I feel like a lot of the episode is dedicated to just getting Goliath to the room where the important events actually go down. In the end, I really like Shadows of the Past. It looks great, the atmosphere works, and we get some great characterization for Hakon and the captain. I think that after all the hustle and bustle of the Avalon trilogy, it's nice to have a smaller scale episode that focuses on just a handful of characters. So our next stop on the world tour is going to be Queen Florence Island off the coast of Canada, and in this episode we're going to learn a little more about the third race and how they are not allowed to directly interfere with mortal affairs. My favorite part of this episode is probably its villain. I think that Raven is a smart and manipulative character, and I love how he takes advantage of Goliath's ideals in order to control him. Like, Raven creates these illusionary gargoyles, and he makes them seem hurt and afraid of the world in order to gain Goliath's sympathy. There's also this great scene where Angela asks Raven why he continues to protect the humans if they attack the gargoyles. Goliath steps in and says that he understands what Raven is going through because he experienced the same scenario at Castle Wyvern. When Raven tells Goliath that grandmother is the source of the sea monster at the start of the episode, he's technically telling the truth. So I like Raven's setup as a villain because I like seeing how he was tricking Goliath into sympathizing with him. The reason I specifically said that I like Raven's setup as a villain is because I didn't like how the good guys learned of his true colors. When Goliath and the others are fighting the Thunderbird, there's this shot of one of Raven's clan members passing through the Thunderbird's wings. Now, this is not an animation error. Okay, this is actually how Angela finds out that Raven has been tricking them. She sees that Raven's gargoyles are just illusions. But the shot lasts like 2 seconds, and so it's really easy to miss. This is the impetus that turns the heroes against the villains, but it's not presented very well. Like, after the shot, the writers could have at least have Angela bring attention to that specific revelation to ensure that we don't miss the significance of that detail. But currently she says something generic like, "Those gargoyles are not what they seem." And it's like, Angela, could you please be more specific? I actually had to re-watch this sequence a few times because it was not at first clear to me why Angela had decided that Raven was actually a bad guy. So I do think that this important turning point of the episode could have been done better. Another thing that I think could have been established better is the apparent conflict between Raven and Natsalani, and how it ties into the theme of heritage. We're told that it is important for Nick to continue his family's tradition, but we aren't really told why tradition as a concept is important. Like, obviously it's important for Nick to understand his heritage because, like, he has to stop Raven from destroying the island. But that's not exactly a relatable scenario to the audience. If Nick doesn't want to fight Raven, why not just let him leave and have Goliath and the others fight Raven? In fact, for all we know, the world travelers could take care of Raven just as easily as Nick. No heroic ancestry required. The episode's saying that tradition is important, but I think it could do a better job at explaining why it's important on a broader scale. In the end, I'm not a big fan of this episode. I like the setup with Raven, but I don't think that the message comes across very well, and I think that the episode could progress more smoothly. I'm going to wrap up this video with Kingdom, which is the first time we see New York since Avalon Part 1. This is where we get to see how Hudson and the trio have been getting by since the sudden disappearance of Goliath, Elisa, and Bronx. The main character of this episode is Brooklyn, since he's the second in command and Goliath is off in Avalon. Back in Upgrade, Brooklyn was competing with Broadway and Lexington to be the leader, but when he realized the implications of being second in command, he was nervous about receiving the title. So we can say that logically, one of the main purposes of Kingdom is to explore how Brooklyn handles being the leader. At the start of the episode, Brooklyn is nervous about giving orders. There's the part when Broadway, Lexington, and even Talon want to go interrogate Xanatos, but Brooklyn thinks that revealing Goliath's disappearance would be a bad move. Even though Brooklyn has the authority to call the shots, he sighs and lets everyone go to the Erie building because he's nervous about making mistakes of his own. But later on, when Maggie asks Brooklyn for help in rescuing Talon, Brooklyn realizes something. He's the only one that can command the Gargoyles to go to the labyrinth to save Talon. He learns that it's not about being successful so much as it's about trying in the first place. There's a great line when Hudson asks Brooklyn, "I thought you didn't want to get involved." And Brooklyn replies, "This has nothing to do with what I want." He's not saving Talon because the girl he likes asked him to. He's not doing this to impress her. Instead, Brooklyn goes to save Talon because it's the right thing to do. He learns the responsibility that comes with being a leader, and that sometimes you have to do what you are uncomfortable with for someone else's sake. While we're sort of on the subject of Maggie, I love the scene at the end when Fang says that he'll let Maggie go if the Gargoyles leave quietly. Brooklyn says, "Okay, but we get to take Maggie with us." And at first, everyone, including Maggie, is like, "Brooklyn, what the heck is wrong with you?" But then it's revealed that his plan all along was to secretly give the key to Maggie, so that way she could save Talon. And I love this part for two reasons. So number one, this is the make or break moment for Brooklyn. This is where he is faced with one of the most critical decisions in the episode. And at first it seems like he's chosen to go with what he wants rather than what is best for everyone. The episode momentarily tricks you into thinking that Brooklyn is abusing his power. But then it's revealed that Brooklyn is actually using his authority for the greater good, proving that he has learned about the responsibility that comes with leadership. The brief moment that made you think that Brooklyn made the wrong decision makes his actual decision all the more impactful. It's sort of like how at the end of The Return of the King, Frodo chooses to not destroy the ring, and for a brief moment it seems like all the buildup was for nothing. But that makes the ring's destruction a few moments later even more cathartic. Kingdom does the same thing, and I think that's why Brooklyn's choice might be the best scene in the episode. So number two, Brooklyn's decision to give Maggie the key represents him letting go of what he wants. In the past, he's been driven by his attraction to Maggie, but now that he's faced with this critical moment, Brooklyn recognizes that, in his own words, this has nothing to do with what I want. He knows he has to make this difficult choice because otherwise, everyone in the labyrinth would suffer. There's also a shot afterwards where Maggie is hugging Talon, and you can see Brooklyn in the background. He's sad but accepting of Maggie's choice. Basically, Brooklyn learns a lot in this episode. He learns about what it means to be a leader and that sometimes you have to sacrifice what you want for someone else's benefit. So I think that his character development was done really well here. Each of the four mutates gets some development and story continuation here as well. Fang in particular has some really good moments. Like now that the mutates have resigned themselves to life in the labyrinth, Fang has started to see Talon as a threat of sorts. Maggie and Claw are too mild to pose much danger to Fang, but Talon on the other hand, he could be trouble. And we get to see how, even though Talon has nothing against him, Fang is still suspicious of Talon. It's kind of like how in, I think part 3 of City of Stone, Duncan didn't trust Macbeth, even though Macbeth had no intention of betraying the crown. There's even a scene here where Fang sarcastically refers to Talon as the king, despite Talon saying he never claimed to be in charge. I like seeing Fang's paranoia drive him to take command of the labyrinth. It's a neat concept that the people who race to obtain power are oftentimes the ones that are the most cowardly. As for the other mutates, each of them get some good moments as well. Talon of course learns to accept leadership like Brooklyn, though in Talon's case leadership is not intentionally given to him. Like Talon and Fang both choose to become leaders, but for different reasons. Fang seizes leadership because of his own desires, like he fears being controlled by others, so he scrambles to take control so that no one can tell him what to do. But Talon, on the other hand, seizes leadership from Fang, not because he wants to be leader, but because he knows that he's the only one that can keep Fang in check. And I think there's a great dynamic there. The episode is exploring what it means to be a leader, as well as why some people are drawn to power more than others. Maggie and even Claw have some cool moments here as well, though not as many as Talon or Fang. We get to see how Maggie trusts the Gargoyles after the events of The Cage a few episodes back. And at the end, when Brooklyn demands to take Maggie with him, I like that Maggie was protesting it as well. Her goal was not to escape the situation, but rather she wanted to stop Fang. She wasn't being selfish, she was being selfless. Even Claw has a nice character arc in this episode. He starts off by sort of going along with Fang, but he recognizes that Fang is abusing his leadership, so he helps Maggie escape. And that's something that I love about this show. I love that the background characters, like Claw, have developments and story arcs of their own. All four of the mutates get some development in this episode, and I think that's awesome. Lastly, I think that some aspects of the animation are pretty good here. The characters are highly expressive, which you can see in the first two screenshots. Now, I know that some people don't like when Gargoyles employs more cartoony art styles, but I personally don't mind it because I think that it gives the characters a lot of personality and energy. It makes them look like they are interested in what's going on in the episode, which I really like. And next, I don't really know how to describe this, but I feel like the character models in this episode have a good sense of physical weight. By that I mean that the character's hair moves like real hair, or when any of the Gargoyles puts his wings into a cape, the cape moves like a real cape would. So next time you watch Kingdom, I encourage you to pay close attention to the movement of the characters. Like, for example, in that part where Brooklyn runs on all fours in the screenshot on the right. That being said, I do think that there are a couple of problems with the animation as well. For me, I thought that the shading was a bit wonky. It sometimes seemed inconsistent between frames, so the scene's lighting source seemed to be all over the place. It's pretty awkward. Next, the lip sync is also a bit problematic. What you hear doesn't always match up with what you see, and I found that distracting. And lastly, if you look closely, Bronx even appears at one part, even though he's supposed to be with Goliath and Elisa. So the animation in this episode is an interesting case, because I think that it does some things really well, and other things not so well. I don't like the scene where Xanatos tests out his security system on Talon and the Gargoyles. I don't mind the idea of it. I mean, using the situation for a test run is something that I think Xanatos would totally do, but it's unintentionally hilarious how bad this security system is. The turrets are laughably inaccurate. They demolish much of the castle, and the cannons themselves are easily bent by Broadway, for starters. I mean, given that Xanatos built these things to defend against Gargoyles, you'd think he'd get cannons that the Gargoyles could not mold like clay. We might say that Xanatos did not put much effort into the security system because he could easily afford to pay for any damage caused, but that doesn't save this action scene from being pretty disappointing in my opinion. In the end, I think that Kingdom is an episode full of fantastic character development. I thought that the theme of what it means to be a leader was established effectively through Brooklyn, Talon, and Fang, and I loved seeing Brooklyn grow up in this episode. So I think that it's a strong episode overall. So before I end the video, there are a couple of things that I want to talk about real quick. First is Angela, who we met a couple of episodes back. From here on out, she's one of the show's major characters. So I think Angela is pretty cool. You know, sometimes a TV show will add new regular characters in an attempt to squeeze more life out of the show, but I don't think that's the case for Angela. She doesn't feel like a gimmick to prolong the life of the series. Instead, she's an interesting character in her own right. She's got her unique background and her parentage, for example. So I'm glad that she has like a personal connection to Goliath, because it leads to some great interactions between the two characters. Obviously, since we just started the world tour, we haven't seen a whole lot of Angela yet, but in the next video we should be able to explore her character a bit more. We also got introduced to Jalapena a while back, which becomes a sort of running gag from now on. So as it turns out, the line was actually put into the show on a dare, but I think that Jalapena actually makes the characters more relatable in a subtle way. When I'm around my friends and family, we have our own inside jokes that nobody else understands, and that's exactly what Jalapena does. It's a little inside joke between Elisa and the Gargoyles that makes them feel even more like an actual group of friends. And I like that the series doesn't go overboard with it and try and drop a jalapeno in every single episode. Instead, I think it's something that pops up frequently enough to be funny without becoming annoying. Lastly, this next part is probably obvious to anyone who's been watching the show for a while, but as someone who just got on board with the series a few months ago, I thought that there was a neat parallel between the Gargoyles in the show and angels as they are usually depicted in stories. So first of all, angels are oftentimes portrayed as unseen guardians, which is exactly what the Gargoyles are in this show. This comparison is also hinted at within the episodes themselves. Like in, I think, The Cage, Elisa specifically refers to Goliath as her guardian angel. And of course, Goliath used to refer to Demona as his angel of the night. There's even an episode in the non-canon third season entitled Angels in the Night, which is in direct reference to the Gargoyles themselves. Now, what made me first start seeing this parallel was the choice of names for Angela and Gabriel. The name Angela, of course, has the word angel in it, which is fitting since Angela's supposed to be like the opposite of Demona, who has the word demon in her name. But what sealed the deal for me was the name Gabriel. Maybe the choice of name was pure coincidence, but Gabriel is the name of an angel in the Bible, so I wonder if that was what they were going for. Again, I assume people probably noticed these connections years ago, but I thought they were cool and I just wanted to point them out. Anyways, that's all I've got to say for now. In the next video, we're going to focus on the majority of the world tour. It's going to be interesting to review those episodes since they're structured a bit differently from what we've seen so far. And by the way, I was actually hoping to get this video out a couple weeks ago, but due to certain circumstances in my personal life, I've had fewer chances to record lines than I would have liked. So this video took longer to make than it should have. Still, even when I was unable to record, I would try and work ahead by going on to whatever episodes were next and like writing scripts and that sort of stuff. So I actually have material written up through like The Hound of Ulster right now. So hopefully I can get the next video out at least a little more quickly. It really depends on how often I can record my lines. Anyway, that's all I've got to say for now. And thank you so much for watching the video. I hope that you got something out of it, and I'll see you all next time.